The dust motes in the late afternoon light danced in the vacant space where his life had once been. Blake watched them, a slow, aimless drift, much like his own existence since the world had tilted off its axis. He traced the rim of a cold mug, the ceramic slick beneath his thumb. It had been months since the incident, since the collapse of not just a structure, but of everything he'd built, everything he'd loved. The whispers followed him everywhere, hushed accusations in boardrooms, sympathetic glances from former colleagues, the phantom scent of pulverized concrete, and something far more sickening. He was a man adrift, anchored only by a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, constricting his breath. His reputation, once a meticulously crafted edifice of innovation and precision, lay in ruins, much like the project that had claimed his family. The firm had quietly dismissed him, the polite words of regret masking the eager scramble to distance themselves from the liability. He hadn't fought it. There was no fight left in him, no energy to defend a ghost. The call had come unexpectedly, a sharp intrusion into the muted gray of his days. A crisp, authoritative voice belonging to an estate lawyer had informed him of an inheritance. A distant relative, a great-aunt he barely remembered, had passed. Her estate was modest, save for one peculiar asset, a lighthouse. A forgotten, crumbling sentinel on a desolate stretch of coastline, miles from any town of consequence. Blake had initially dismissed it. Another responsibility, another anchor. But the lawyer's persistent follow-up, detailing the remote location, the sheer isolation of the property, had begun to chip away at his apathy. The irony was not lost on him. It was a project, a colossal, demanding project that might just consume enough of him to quiet the incessant clamor of his thoughts. A sanctuary, perhaps, from the relentless judgment of the world and, more importantly, from himself. He'd signed the papers with a numb hand, a fleeting image of a towering, salt-weathered beacon sparking a faint, unfamiliar stir within him. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was more like a desperate impulse, a final, unarticulated plea for a purpose, any purpose, beyond simply enduring. The journey had been long, a steady unwinding of asphalt that gave way to gravel, then to a barely discernible track carved into the wild, wind-battered land. Rain squalls lashed against the windshield, blurring the already stark landscape of low-lying scrub and jagged rocks. There was no phone signal, no radio reception, only the rhythmic slap of the wipers and the grinding of the engine. He welcomed the isolation, the stripping away of connectivity. Finally, as the last bruised light of the day bled into the turbulent horizon, the lighthouse emerged from the mist and spray. It stood alone, a solitary, defiant pillar against the immense, churning gray of the sea and sky. The lantern room, once a proud eye, was a gaping, shattered maw, its glass panes long gone, leaving it exposed to the merciless elements. The attached keeper's cottage, a low-slung building huddled at its base, seemed to sag under the weight of years and abandonment, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. It wasn't just dilapidated, it felt forgotten, a place where time had not merely passed but had actively corroded every surface, every memory. The air here was thick with the scent of damp stone, salt spray, and something else, a faint, earthy smell, like old earth stirred up from deep beneath. The wind howled, a mournful, relentless sound that seemed to carry ancient laments. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, the wind immediately snatching at his clothes, whipping his hair across his face. He pulled his jacket tighter, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The entire property was enclosed by a low, crumbling stone wall, barely visible beneath a tangle of thorny bushes and sea grass. He walked towards the cottage door, a heavy, weathered slab of oak, its paint peeling in vast, curling flakes. The lock was rusted solid, but the estate lawyer had provided a heavy iron key, still gleaming despite its age. As he moved deeper into the cottage, navigating by the weak light filtering through the grimy windows, he noticed the peculiar solidity of the floor in one corner. It wasn't the typical creaking wood of an old dwelling. It felt unnaturally firm, almost like concrete. He knelt, scraping away a thin film of grit and dust with his gloved hand. Beneath it, a faint seam became visible, running across the flagstones. Following it, his fingers brushed against a heavy, iron ring, set flush with the floor. He tugged, and with a guttural groan, a section of the stone floor lifted a few inches. He peered into the black aperture, a narrow, stone-lined shaft descending into absolute gloom. It was a subterranean chamber, a secret, forgotten part of the lighthouse's foundation. An underground bunker. The words from the estate lawyer's brief property description echoed in his mind, something he'd barely registered amidst his haze of grief. A private, self-contained space, buried deep. The initial determination he'd felt, the desperate need for purpose, now mingled with a burgeoning unease. This lighthouse wasn't just old, it held secrets, buried deep beneath its decay, waiting for him to unearth them. The roar of the ocean outside seemed to intensify, a hungry, waiting sound. The salt-laced wind, relentless and cold, whipped around the lighthouse, a constant, mournful song against the ancient stone. Blake didn't mind it. The biting air was a physical sensation, a counterpoint to the hollow ache inside him, and for that, he was grateful. He had traded the stale, suffocating air of his old life for this raw, untamed desolation, and he was determined to make something of it. This crumbling tower, a monument to forgotten purpose, would be his. He started with the ground floor, a vast, circular chamber reeking of mildew and damp earth. Piles of debris, rotting timbers, rusted metal scraps, shattered glass lay scattered like the bones of some forgotten beast. Blake worked methodically, the architect's instinct for order overriding the inertia that had plagued him for months. He donned heavy gloves, grabbed a shovel, and began to clear. Dust, thick and ancient, billowed with every movement, catching the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The sounds of his labor were magnified in the cavernous space, the scrape of metal on stone, the clatter of dislodged rocks, the rhythmic rasp of his own breathing. He found himself almost enjoying the physical exertion, the ache in his muscles a welcome distraction. The days blurred into a pattern of demolition and discovery. He unearthed a broken lantern, its glass long gone, and a pile of waterlogged maritime charts, their ink faded into illegibility. It was when he began to tackle a particularly stubborn section of wall, covered in layers of flaking whitewash and embedded with loose, damp stones, that he noticed it. A rectangular outline, subtly different from the rough-hewn masonry around it. He ran a gloved hand over the surface, feeling a faint seam. Curiosity, a flicker of something beyond despair, stirred within him. He pried at a loose stone, then another, the mortar crumbling like dry biscuit. He pulled it out, a small, heavy wooden box, bound with tarnished brass straps. It was sealed tight, no visible latch. Blake, his heart thrumming with an unexpected anticipation, fetched a pry bar. With the groan of ancient wood and metal, the box yielded. Inside, nestled on a bed of brittle, faded velvet, lay a single, tarnished silver locket, its surface intricately engraved with a swirling, almost hypnotic pattern. Beside it, a brittle, yellowed drawing, meticulously rendered in what looked like charcoal. It depicted a stylized lighthouse, not the one he was in, but something older, more angular, with strange, almost predatory angles. It felt less like a beacon and more like a symbol of something watching. He continued his work, the locket. And drawing tucked into his pocket, a new puzzle to ponder. Days later, while clearing a particularly deep recess beneath a collapsed wooden platform, his shovel struck something solid that wasn't bedrock. He cleared away more rubble, revealing a heavy, rusted iron hatch, almost perfectly camouflaged against the rough floor. Its massive bolts were seized with rust, but he was an architect, accustomed to problem-solving. He spent the next few hours with a can of penetrating oil and a heavy wrench, grunting and straining until, with a final, protesting shriek of metal, the bolts slowly began to turn. The hatch was surprisingly heavy, requiring all his strength to heave it open. Blake retrieved his most powerful work lantern. This wasn't a basement, this was something deliberately hidden, buried deep. An underground bunker. He hesitated at the lip of the opening, the raw, cold air of the shaft seeming to pull at him. A wave of unease, distinct from his usual melancholy, washed over him. He felt a flicker of doubt, a momentary question about what he was doing here, alone, digging into the forgotten places of a forgotten structure. But the determination, the desperate need for purpose, pushed him forward. He needed to know. He started down the steps, his boots echoing unnaturally loudly in the confined space. The bunker was small, circular, its rough concrete walls damp and slick. His lantern beam crawled across the walls, revealing peculiar, faded drawings. They were not human, not quite animal, but distorted, elongated forms that seemed to writhe and contort. They looked ancient, yet somehow unnervingly fresh, as if the ink had only just dried. In the center of the bunker stood a single, heavy, iron-bound chest, much larger and more formidable than the wooden box he'd found earlier. He approached it slowly, his breath misting in the frigid air. It was unintelligible, yet undeniably there, a breathy, sibilant sound that raised gooseflesh on his arms. Nothing. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady himself. Blake stood frozen, his heart now hammering against his ribs with frantic urgency. The air in the bunker felt suddenly charged, watchful. The silence was no longer merely empty, it felt pregnant with an unseen presence. His rational mind fought against the irrational fear coiling in his gut. Grief, he told himself. Exhaustion. The isolation playing tricks. He was no longer alone in this desolate place. Something here was awake. He found himself attributing the strange occurrences to the building's age, the relentless coastal weather, or simply his own frayed nerves. A groan from the ancient timbers? Just the lighthouse settling, he told himself, adjusting to its new occupant. A trick of the light, the sun dipping below the horizon, playing illusions on his tired eyes. Probably just the accumulated decay of decades, stirred by his renovations. His mind, trained in logic and structural integrity, fought fiercely against any other explanation. He needed answers, concrete data to anchor his wavering composure. He decided to delve into the lighthouse's past. Perhaps a clear, rational history would dispel the phantom anxieties. He started with the few dusty, water-stained ledgers he'd found tucked away in a forgotten cabinet in the lantern room, their pages brittle with age. Most entries were mundane, supply deliveries, weather observations, maintenance logs. But interspersed between the routine scrawls, Blake began to unearth fragmented accounts that snagged at his attention. Mentions of particularly ferocious storms, of course, but also a disproportionate number of shipwrecks along this treacherous stretch of coastline. Not just vessels dashed against the rocks, but some that simply vanished, their wreckage never found, their crews swallowed by the churning gray. Then there were the keepers. A few served for decades, their lives a testament to stoic solitude. Others, however, had briefer tenures. Another, a man named Thomas, simply disappeared. The log entry read, "Keeper Thomas not present for duty. Lamp unlit. Search initiated. No trace found." That was it. Blake also found an old, faded newspaper clipping, tucked like a forgotten leaf between the ledger pages. Nothing overtly supernatural, just the natural anxieties of a hard existence. He spent hours poring over these scraps, his fingers smudged with ancient dust. The research, instead of calming him, only managed to deepen the subtle grooves of apprehension. He had to. Later that afternoon, needing a break from the musty history, Blake began to clear out the underground bunker beneath the lighthouse. It was a cavernous space, carved into the bedrock, smelling strongly of damp earth and disuse. Old crates, rusted tools, and broken equipment lay scattered, remnants of forgotten eras. He dragged a particularly heavy, iron-banded chest towards the entrance, intending to inspect its contents in better light. The metal scraped against the rough concrete floor, a grating protest. It sounded like something heavy, perhaps a sack of grain, shifting and falling. Blake froze, his muscles tensed. He stood utterly still, listening. The only sounds were his own ragged breath and the distant, muffled roar of the surf. He told himself it was just a rat, or a piece of the crumbling rock face finally giving way. The old building settling, again. He took a deep breath, released the chest, and grabbed his powerful flashlight. He swept it across the corners, along the uneven walls, into every alcove. Nothing. No displaced sacks, no fallen rocks. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. He clenched his jaw, refusing to give in to the irrational fear. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation, settling on the echo of the chest, amplified and distorted by the bunker's acoustics. He resumed his task, trying to ignore the prickle on his nape. He dragged the chest further, his movements more hurried now. Blake spun around, flashlight beam darting. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was the bunker, he thought, the deep, damp air. His imagination, fueled by the unsettling histories he'd just read. He gathered his tools, his work for the bunker abruptly finished. As he climbed the stone steps, he heard it again, fainter this time, but undeniable, a low, drawn-out sigh, like wind whistling through a narrow crevice, but it seemed to emanate from the very stone walls of the bunker itself. It was mournful, almost sorrowful, and utterly without a logical source. Blake paused on the top step, his hand on the heavy wooden door, unwilling to look back. His rationalizations felt thin, frayed at the edges, like old rope about to snap. The unease was no longer a prickle, it was a tightening knot in his gut. He worked with a fierce, almost desperate focus, chipping away at calcified rust, repointing crumbling mortar, his hands raw, his muscles screaming. It was a good kind of pain, a distraction. But lately, the distractions weren't enough. He'd blame it on fatigue, the wind playing tricks, the isolation finally getting to him. He'd rub his temples, clench his jaw, and push harder, deeper into the lighthouse's forgotten corners. His current project involved the structural integrity of the base, a task that demanded exploration of the lower levels. The blueprints, faded and brittle, indicated an old access point to an underground bunker beneath the main structure, likely used for storage or as a storm shelter by previous keepers. The smell shifted from salt and damp stone to something else entirely, a metallic tang mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay, like forgotten flowers pressed into stale earth. The entrance to the underground bunker itself was a low, arched doorway, choked with ancient cobwebs and a thick, velvety moss. Blake had to stoop to pass through, his headlamp beam cutting a stark circle through the absolute blackness. The air inside was still, dead, pressing against his lungs. It felt like walking into a tomb. Water seeped from the rough-hewn stone walls, gathering in stagnant puddles. On the uneven floor. He started clearing away the detritus, assessing the stability of the walls, his breath pluming in the frigid air. That's when it began to intensify. A flicker. Not at the edge of his vision this time, but directly in the path of his lamp. A fleeting, translucent figure, tall and gaunt, standing by a far wall, its head bowed. He blinked, hard, then looked again. Nothing. Just the rough stone, slick with moisture. He resumed his work, but his movements were jerky, his senses hyper-alert. Every drip, every creak of settling stone, was amplified. Then came the sound, a low, keening sob, faint but unmistakable, seeming to emanate from the very stone around him. It was a woman's voice, thick with despair, a sound Blake knew intimately from his own sleepless nights. The sound echoed, distorted, then faded. Only the drip remained. His grief, he thought, was finally manifesting. This was it. The breakdown. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against them, trying to banish the images, the sounds. When he opened them, he saw it again clearer this time. It stood by the collapsed cot, its form indistinct, shimmering like heat haze, but the posture was one of profound sorrow. It lifted a hand, a gesture of yearning, and then dissolved into the damp air, leaving behind only the metallic tang and the lingering echo of a sob. Blake stumbled back, hitting a pile of stacked, decaying wooden boxes. One of them, rotted through, gave way with a soft thud, spilling its contents onto the gritty floor. Amidst a cascade of brittle paper and rusted metal scraps, a small, leather-bound book lay exposed. It was water-stained and swollen, its spine cracked, but intact. A log book. He wiped away some of the grime with his sleeve, revealing faded script on the cover, Keeper's Journal, E. Thorne. He sat down on an overturned crate, his heart still racing, and opened the book to a random page. The ink was faded, the handwriting tight and spidery, but legible. August 14, 1903. The isolation grows. The wind carries voices now, thin and reedy, like children crying for a parent who isn't there. I swear I see her, sometimes, standing by the south window, her hair like spun moonlight. But when I turn, there is only the glass, reflecting my own gaunt face. Blake's breath hitched. He read on, his eyes scanning frantically. September 3, 1903. The sounds are constant. Always the crying. I've tried to ignore it, to busy my hands, but it seeps into my thoughts, twists them until I doubt what is real and what is born of this cursed place. The hair on his arms stood on end. He wasn't just reading a historical record, he was reading his own mind. The voices, the figure, the crushing despair, it wasn't just his grief. It was happening again. Thorne's descent, chronicled in these water-stained pages, mirrored his own fraying reality with horrifying precision. He flipped to another page, his fingers stiff. October 1, 1903. They are here. In the bunker. They want something. My little girl. They speak of her, as if he is still here, trapped within these stones. I cannot escape them. This lighthouse, it feeds on sorrow. It takes what you hold dear and twists it into a torment from which there is no waking. Blake dropped the journal as if it had burned him. It landed with a wet slap on the stone floor. He stared at the faded words, the spectral figure, the echoes of a lost child, all coalescing into a single, terrifying truth. This wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a trap. And he, like Thorne before him, was already caught. The air in the bunker felt impossibly heavy, suffocating. The drip 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 of water now sounded like a slow, deliberate countdown. Blake stared at the journal, splayed open on the cold stone, the previous keeper's frantic scrawl accusing him from the page. The spectral drawing, crude yet undeniably chilling, seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light in the dimness. A trap. The word echoed in the hollow chamber of his chest, a heavy, suffocating weight. He bent slowly. His fingers hesitating, then closing around the damp, rough cover. The leather felt strangely warm, almost alive, beneath his touch. He flipped through the preceding pages, his gaze snagging on repeated references, the deep place, the feeding ground, the bunker where the sorrow collects. The words weren't just descriptions, they were a desperate warning, a breadcrumb trail laid by a man descending into madness, or perhaps, clarity. A new, terrifying determination solidified within him. He had to know. The air grew heavier with each descending step, thick with the smell of brine, damp earth, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that made his stomach clench. He counted the turns, a monotonous rhythm against the frantic beating of his own pulse. 100 steps. 200. Finally, the staircase ended at a heavy, rusted iron door, almost indistinguishable from the rock face. It looked like a tomb entrance. The previous keeper's journal had mentioned a hidden catch. Blake ran his hand along the seam, feeling for a brake, a lever. He pressed it, and with a groan that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, the door slowly, reluctantly, swung inward. Beyond lay the underground bunker. The flashlight beam wavered, revealing a space far larger than he had anticipated. The metallic tang was stronger, mingled with the cloying scent of decay, like old, wet fabric left to rot. His light played across rough-hewn walls, glistening with moisture, and a floor of uneven, packed earth. Strange, crude symbols were carved into the stone, repeating patterns of swirling lines and jagged angles that seemed to writhe in the periphery of his vision. They weren't just decorative, they felt like wards, or perhaps, invitations. His breath hitched. This was no storage room. This was a place of purpose, a place of ritual. Then he saw them. Nestled in a corner, half buried in the damp earth, were a few small, wooden toys. A rocking horse, missing an eye. A miniature wooden ship, its sails long rotted away. And a small, porcelain doll, its painted smile cracked, its single remaining glass eye staring up at him with an unnerving blankness. The children. The lost children from the journal. The beam of his flashlight flickered, then dimmed, bathing the bunker in a sickly, pulsating glow. All coalescing into a single, insidious voice that seemed to rise from the very stones. "You came for solitude, didn't you, Blake?" The voice slithered, not in his ears. Directly into his mind, echoing his own thoughts. To escape the ache. The emptiness. He stumbled back, hitting a damp wall, the shock of the voice rendering him momentarily immobile. It knew his name. It knew his reason for being here. "You carry it with you, don't you?" The soft hair. He gasped, a guttural sound torn from his throat. His mind reeled, images of his family, of the accident, flashing before his eyes with terrifying clarity. He saw the crumpled metal, the shattered glass, the silent, still forms. The vacant chairs. The dreams that haunt your sleep. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, trying to dislodge the insidious words, the invasive memories. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a violation, an assault on his most sacred pain. It was feeding on his sorrow, growing stronger with every memory it dredged up. The lighthouse wasn't a sanctuary, it was a lure, a spider's web designed to ensnare the broken, the isolated, to feast on their despair. He was just another victim, like Thorn, like the children implied by the toys. When he opened his eyes, the bunker seemed to writhe around him. The doll in the corner seemed to have moved, its blank eye now fixed directly on him. "It's what you crave, isn't it?" It wasn't just his own grief anymore, it was the accumulated sorrow of generations, the despair of every soul this place had consumed. It was trying to break him, to make him surrender to the overwhelming tide of anguish. He clutched the flashlight, its beam now a weak, flickering pulse, his knuckles white. The air was thick, suffocating. He understood now. The lighthouse's true purpose wasn't to guide ships, but to draw on the lost, the grieving, to feed this ancient, malevolent hunger. And he, with his profound, unyielding grief, was the perfect meal. He was trapped, not just by the remote coast or the crumbling stone, but by his own broken heart. The crushing wave of despair threatened to drown Blake, but a spark, cold and defiant, ignited deep within him. He would not surrender. This wasn't just grief, it was an invasion, a predatory sorrow seeking to consume him whole. He stumbled backwards, away from the invisible pressure, his eyes scanning the narrow confines of the lantern room. Escape. That was the only thought. He lunged for the spiraling iron staircase, his boots clattering on the worn steps. He took them two at a time, a desperate scramble down the core of the lighthouse, the metal groaning under his weight. Halfway down, a sudden, jarring lurch threw him against the cold, sweating wall. The steps beneath his feet seemed to ripple, a momentary illusion, but enough to send a jolt of panic through his already frayed nerves.
He caught himself, breath-rasping, and continued his descent, the lighthouse itself seeming to resist his urgency, its ancient structure vibrating with a malevolent hum.
When he reached the ground floor, he shoved against the heavy oak door leading outside, the one he had painstakingly repaired. It should have opened with a familiar creak. Instead, it was jammed solid. He threw his weight against it, again and again, the wood groaning, but the thick iron bolts, which he knew he had left unlatched, were now visibly engaged, sunk deep into their housings. He tried the secondary exit, a smaller door leading to the storage shed. Locked, too, the padlock he hadn't used in weeks now firmly in place, glinting dully in the dim light. He was trapped. He heard her laughter, light and airy, then replaced by a choked gasp. His daughter's voice, calling for him, then dissolving into a watery gurgle. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of brine and something else, something cloying and metallic, like old blood and rust. A framed photograph of his family, propped on his workbench, suddenly slid forward, tumbling to the concrete floor. The glass shattered, the smiling faces fracturing into 100 jagged pieces. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he tried to gather the shards, a sharp sliver piercing his thumb. He stared at it, then at the broken image, a profound sense of despair threatening to consume him again. This was it, the entity wanted him to break, to give up. But then, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear amidst the chaos. The previous keeper's journal. He had found a cryptic entry, a hastily scrawled diagram beneath a passage about the deep place. The lighthouse wasn't just a tower, it had roots, a hidden foundation. He found the smooth section of wall. He ran his hand over it, feeling a faint seam, a hairline crack he'd dismissed as an imperfection during his initial survey. Now, it felt deliberate. He pushed, pulled, searched for a lever or a catch. Nothing. He pressed it. A low, grinding rumble echoed through the earth, a sound of ancient gears reluctantly stirring. The section of wall groaned, then slowly, agonizingly, began to pivot inwards, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. This was it. The underground bunker. The passage opened into a larger, circular chamber, its walls constructed from rough, unmortared stone blocks. On it lay a collection of objects, a rusted iron compass, its needle frozen, pointing west, a tarnished silver locket, empty, and a thick, leather-bound book, its pages brittle and yellowed. He picked up the book. It was a ledger, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. Then he found it. A detailed drawing of the lighthouse, with specific constellations marked around it, and a series of cryptic instructions. The ritual. It wasn't about destroying the entity, but about binding it, about forcing it back into a dormant state. The text spoke of a locus of grief, a sacrificial light, and a binding of bone and blood. He read on, his breath catching in his throat. It required an offering, not of a life, but of a memory, a profound personal sorrow, amplified and channeled. And it needed to be performed at the apex of the lighthouse, during a specific celestial alignment, using a fragment of the structure itself, imbued with the light. The binding of bone and blood. Blake's gaze fell to his bleeding thumb. A dangerous sacrifice. A desperate act. This wasn't surrender. This was a fight. He could contain it. He would contain it. The crushing wave of despair had threatened to drown Blake, but a spark, cold and defiant, ignited deep within him. He would not surrender. He clenched his fists, the knuckles bone-white, and pushed back against the insidious tendrils that had begun to coil around his mind. The fragmented sketches, the frantic marginalia in the keeper's log, the recurring symbols etched into the deepest stones of the lighthouse, they all pointed to one place. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something ancient and metallic, like dried blood on rusted iron. Each step on the rough-hewn stone steps echoed, amplified by the suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. The passage twisted, narrowed, then opened into a cavernous space. This was it, the underground bunker. It wasn't a bunker in the modern sense, but a vast, subterranean chamber carved from the bedrock beneath the lighthouse, its walls slick with perpetual damp. Crude, massive stone pillars supported a ceiling lost to the gloom. A central altar, a rough-hewn slab of black basalt, dominated the space, surrounded by crumbling carvings that depicted a swirling maelstrom, desperate figures, and a gaping maw. Blake's breath hitched. It was a pressure on his chest, a whisper at the edge of his hearing that promised only oblivion. "You won't have me," Blake rasped, his voice a frail protest against the immensity of the dread. He moved towards the altar, his steps deliberate, each footfall a defiant declaration. He had brought the items he believed necessary, a small, tarnished silver compass he'd found hidden in the lighthouse's original architect's desk, a handful of sea salt collected from the highest tide pool, and a single, unburnt wick from the lamproom. As he neared the altar, the air temperature plummeted, and a frigid gust, smelling of grave soil and stagnant water, swept through the bunker, though there was no discernible breeze. He sought his daughter's face, pale and distant, then his partner's, contorted in silent accusation. Guilt, sharp and agonizing, lanced through him. "This is your fault, Blake. All of it. You brought us here." He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut against the illusory torments. "No," he gritted out, forcing his eyelids open. "Not real." He felt a sudden, crushing weight, as if the entire ocean above had pressed down upon his shoulders. His knees buckled, but he fought it, refusing to fall. He remembered the keeper's last, desperate entry, "Seal the breach. Turn the eye inward." He poured the sea salt in a careful circle around it, then laid the unburnt wick beside the compass. This was the ritual, as best he could decipher it. It wasn't about banishing, but about containing, about turning the entity's own insidious power back on itself, using the lighthouse's original, sacred purpose as an anchor. As his fingers brushed the rough stone, a torrent of images slammed into his mind, violent and unbidden. He saw not visions, but memories, not his own, but belonging to the lighthouse, to the very bedrock beneath his feet. He had wanted to create a beacon that would not only guide ships but also consume the storms, a morbid alchemist trying to distill sorrow into power. The horrific truth unfurled within Blake's consciousness like a ragged, blood-soaked sail. The lighthouse wasn't just cursed, it was a cage, a carefully constructed vessel designed to contain a fragment of primal despair, an entity birthed from the ocean's endless hunger. And human suffering. And Blake's ancestor, that original architect, had been the one to forge the prison, trapping a malevolence that had slowly, insidiously, grown stronger with every shipwreck, every lost soul, every ounce of grief it could siphon from the world above. And his own family? His recent tragedy? They weren't just victims of fate. They were drawn here, like moths to a corrupted flame, because of his lineage. The entity, weakened by neglect but never truly dormant, had been reaching out, pulling his back to complete the cycle, to feed on his profound sorrow, to finally break free from its ancient prison. His grief wasn't just a byproduct, it was the key the entity needed to shatter its bonds. Blake screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from his throat, not from fear, but from the searing pain of understanding. The images burned, showing him his ancestors' crazed eyes, his desperate attempts to control what he could not, the ultimate failure that left the world vulnerable. The entity had been trying to lure Blake to this very spot, to this very ritual, but for its release, not its sealing. He stumbled back from the altar, the revelation a physical blow. The air crackled with malevolent energy. It lunged, not with claws or teeth, but with a wave of pure, concentrated despair, aimed directly at his mind. Blake staggered, a choked sob escaping him. He was drowning in their spectral grief, his own sorrow magnified 1,000-fold. He was an architect. He understood structure, purpose, the integrity of design. He understood containment. He wasn't performing the entity's ritual. He was performing his ancestors' intended ritual, the one that had been corrupted, twisted. He saw the flaws in the original architect's design, the arrogance that left a gaping hole. He lunged back towards the altar, ignoring the spectral forms that clawed at him, ignoring the mental assault. He grabbed the unburned wick, his hands trembling but resolute. He wasn't going to light it. Lighting it was what his ancestor had done, trying to draw the power. No. He plunged the wick into the small, salt water-filled basin that had been carved into the basalt slab, pushing it deep, grinding it against the stone. He wasn't lighting a flame, he was dousing one that had never been allowed to ignite, symbolizing the stifling of the entity's corrupting influence. He pressed down, his muscles screaming, forcing the wick, the unlit potential, into the stagnant water, into the heart of the curse. The bunker convulsed. The roars turned to shrieks of pure, unadulterated rage and pain. The crushing pressure lifted, replaced by an agonizing suction, as if the very air was being ripped from the chamber. Blake felt a terrible draining sensation, as if his own life force was being pulled into the stone. He held on, gritting his teeth, his eyes fixed on the struggling wick, on the silver compass that now spun violently, then slowly, agonizingly, began to settle, its needle pointing not to the altar, but resolutely, steadily, to the north. The shriek intensified, reaching an unbearable pitch, then abruptly, impossibly, snapped. A profound silence fell, heavier and more absolute than before. The air was still frigid, but the malevolent pressure was gone. Blake stood panting, leaning heavily on the altar, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the assault. He had done it. He had sealed the breach, but the cost. The truth of his lineage, the horror of his ancestors' folly, the realization that his family's tragedy was a direct consequence of this ancient, terrible design, that would forever be etched into his soul. The compass needle, after its frantic dance, had settled. Not north, not south, but directly, unervingly, at the heart of the basalt slab. Blake watched the unburned wick, waiting for a flicker, a spark, anything. Instead, the air in the underground bunker grew heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. The salt circle, a fragile barrier, seemed to shimmer in the anemic light of his lantern, its crystalline structure momentarily appearing to glow with a faint, internal luminescence. Then, the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a profound, absolute void that swallowed even the distant moan of the sea above. He looked at his hands, trembling, and saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the lantern's flame. It was not a physical wind, but something else, a resonance in the very fabric of the bunker. It was in the hushed, sterile room, just after the finality had been delivered, the air thick with unspoken grief. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the image, but it clung, insistent. The basalt altar, scarred and ancient, now seemed to pulse with a low, internal thrum. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, a vibration that resonated deep in his bones. The compass needle, still pointing inwards, began to vibrate minutely, a frantic, almost imperceptible hum. Not from flame, but from an internal charring, as if drawing its energy from an unseen source. It shriveled, twisting into a brittle, black husk, without ever igniting. A gasp tore from Blake's throat. This was it. This was the mechanism. The salt, the compass, the wick, they weren't meant to banish, but to bind. To focus. To draw. He stumbled back, his spine hitting the rough-hewn stone wall of the underground bunker. The air, though silent, felt charged, crackling with an invisible energy. The altar. It was a siphon. A conduit. The malevolence wasn't being expelled, it was being contained. Drawn into the very heart of the stone, held captive, perhaps, by the ritual. But what was the cost? What had he just locked away? Or, more terrifyingly, what had he just fed? A new sensation began to creep over him, starting in his fingertips and spreading like a slow, insidious frost. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness, heavier than any physical exhaustion he had ever experienced. It wasn't just his body that felt drained, but his very essence, as if a part of him had been extracted, pulled into the hungry maw of the basalt. He looked at the compass again. He knelt, his knees protesting, and reached out a hand. Then, he saw it. Etched into the surface of the slab, almost invisible until now, were faint, swirling lines. They weren't carvings he had noticed before, but seemed to have emerged, like veins of ore, from within the stone itself. And within those lines, he could discern shapes. Figures. A woman, her face contorted in silent agony. A child, small and indistinct, reaching out. And another figure, gaunt and skeletal, perpetually reaching, perpetually grasping. A collector. It fed. It drew in despair, grief, loss, the very emotions he had brought with him, hoping to find solace. The ritual hadn't banished the malevolence, it had merely formalized his contribution. He had offered his grief, his sorrow, his longing, and it had been accepted, absorbed into the hungry stone. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. His family. His tragedy. The raw, open wound in his soul. He had sought refuge, a sanctuary, but he had merely become another meal for the ancient hunger of the lighthouse. The malevolence didn't just haunt the structure, it was the structure, alive and insatiable, drawing sustenance from the very essence of human suffering. Blake felt a strange, detached calm descend upon him, a terrifying clarity born of utter desolation. The air, though still heavy, no longer felt like a crushing weight. He stood up, his movements stiff and slow, like a marionette with severed strings. He walked to the edge of the salt circle, then stepped over it. Nothing. No resistance, no shock. The barrier was for the ritual, not for him. He was already part of it now. He was a piece of the lighthouse's grim mosaic. When he emerged into the lantern room, the first rays of dawn were painting the horizon in bruised purples and grays. The sea stretched out, vast and indifferent. The lighthouse stood, silent and imposing, its white walls gleaming faintly in the nascent light. It looked the same, yet everything had changed. He felt no victory, no relief. Only an immense, profound emptiness. The grief he had carried, the gnawing sorrow that had driven him to this desolate place, was gone. Not healed, not resolved, but simply absent. Siphoned away. He had traded his pain for something far more terrifying, an absence of feeling, a profound detachment from the very core of his being. Blake looked out at the churning waves, his reflection staring back from the thick glass of the lantern. The lighthouse was quiet now. The malevolence was bound, contained, perhaps even satisfied. But at what cost? The sanctuary he sought had become his tomb, not of flesh, but of spirit. He was free from his grief, yes, but also free from the very humanity that had defined him.